Jeff Lemire unveils the mystical secret behind the Fishfly monster, starting with an immigrant family and the tragic end they met many years ago. We're going to talk about it in our review of Fishflies number 6 from Image Comics. See you in 3. Welcome back to Comical Opinions. Before we dig into the review, let's recap in 60 seconds or less what happened in issue number 5. Fran and the Fishfly monster were captured and held hostage by Butch and Betty Bracken, the twins who apparently have had experience or brushes with the Fishfly monster in the past. They decided to separate the two, keeping Fran locked up in their house in an upstairs bedroom and the monster down in a root cellar. But Fran was able to escape through an upstairs window, free her Fishfly monster friend, and the two of them fled before the police could show up. That brings us to Fishflies number 6. The story is completely centered around Helen Dupuy, who, if you'll recall, is Paul's mother. Paul is the boy who was shot by a convenience store robber at the beginning of the series. She's completely distraught and unsettled by the discovery of these strange runic symbols that were carved in trees and in the ground in the woods near the hospital and near her home. She decides to reach out to a friend of hers who happens to be a fortune teller and a mystic in a local shop. Despite the late hour, it's about 2 a.m., the fortune teller lets her in because she's a friend and decides to give her at least a place of refuge. And the two of them begin to sit and talk. The fortune teller says, Helen, I'm not real, right? I'm not really a fortune teller. It's all stuff that we make up to try and make people feel better. But suddenly the crystal ball that's on the table between them starts to glow, and it hits Helen with a beam of light, and her mind is suddenly transported back to the past of Bell River, at least 100 years or more prior to. The comic then recenters on a family, Bobby Murphy, his wife Biddy, and their son. They're Irish immigrants who come to Canada, and they've decided to settle on a plot of land that they bought near Bell River. Their wagon comes up down the main street, and they decide to stop at the local saloon because they want to get directions because they're having trouble finding the plot of the land. They talk to the saloon owner, who seems pretty friendly, but when they point out where the land is, that they're headed, the saloon owner says, maybe you better forget that you ever came here, because that land is near a family called the Byrne clan, and the Byrne clan is none too friendly about strangers, and they may have some ideas about what they want to do with that land, whether you legally own it or not. But Bobby Murphy isn't having it, and he decides to go settle in the land that he legally purchased. Months later, the Murphys have settled into their home. They've built a cabin or a modest-sized house. They're living off the land. They're establishing themselves as a happy family on the land that they legally purchased. But the Byrne clan comes by and they said, well, maybe you ought to scoot and skedaddle because we've got plans for this land that is going to be part of our logging operation. Bobby Murphy doesn't take the threats or the pushy tactics too seriously, but Biddy Murphy knows a bully when she sees one, and she knows that these types of bullies are not ones that you can just shoo away. So she tries to protect their home and protect their family with ancient runes and wards she set up around the house, because she comes from an ancient Irish family that has developed, for lack of a better term, magic from the hills in which they were born and have lived for generations. But Bobby Murphy is not having any of it because he's a Christian. This is a Christian home, and he wipes out all the protective runes that Biddy has set up. One night, while the Murphy family is sleeping, they hear a noise outside. Biddy wakes up and she says, there are people here, there are people here. They get up and they find that the Murphy clan is under attack by the Byrne clan, who want to clear the land for their own logging operation, and they've started to set fires all around the homestead. Bobby Murphy runs out with his rifle, tries to defend his home, and he is shot down dead. The boy, their son, runs out and tries to follow his father, tries to protect his father, and also tries to be brave, and he is also shot and killed by one of the adult Byrne sons. And that leaves just Biddy, and she's left alone. And even though the Byrne clan is sort of maybe upset or unsettled by the fact that they've just killed a child in addition to the father, they decide to run off and let the homestead burn. But Biddy chases after them with her rifle, but doesn't get very far because she's on foot and they're on horseback. Biddy is overcome with grief and rage and all the feelings that you expect that since her home has been destroyed and her husband and child have been killed. So she walks into the woods and starts carving these runes into the trees and sigils on the ground, creating essentially a magical space. She then later sneaks into the Byrne clan's logging operation and finds the adult son who killed her boy and kidnaps him at rifle point and says, "You're coming with me." She takes him to that place, makes him stand in the sigil, and shoots him dead. The blood pouring out on the ground on top of the sigil now sort of activates this spell. And suddenly all the Fishflies come off the river, engulf him and encase him, and turns him into the first Fishfly monster of which we've seen for the rest of the series. Biddy orders the Fishfly monster to wipe out his own family, and then that sets the stage for basically a curse, a cycle of curses that infect Bell River for years upon decades. Then Helen snaps out of it, and now she knows what's going on. And at the end of the issue, she receives a phone call about her son Paul, which may start the cycle all over again. Okay, so let's talk about the technical aspects, starting with the character work. This is a big deal issue because it really changes the direction of the story, where up to this point everything's been focused on young Fran and her strange friendship with this Fishfly monster that was the converted body of the robber that shot down Paul, the young boy who is injured at the beginning of the series. But now the focus shifts because we've got the background about where this Fishfly monster curse comes from, why it's there, and we now know that it's sort of a catalyst created by the grief of a mother after her family has been killed. And now Helen has this realization that she is not the cause of all the problems, but she is very much a parallel to Biddy Murphy, and that she might be continuing the cycle. In effect, the monster may have come about because of Helen's grief, and that puts her at the focal point of the story and where it potentially could go going forward. So even though the story originally started off by being all about Fran, it now has a major shift towards Helen as almost a central character, or at least a central catalyst for where we go from here. Let's move over to the artwork. So Jeff Lemire has been pretty much a one-man band when it comes to this comic series, but in this issue, he brings on a guest artist by the name of Sean Kurineru. And for the majority of the flashback, Sean is in charge of all the artwork. It's still very kind of storybook in tone and atmosphere, and Kurineru's art style is low fidelity in that sense, but also it gives it that sort of old-fashioned aesthetic that Lemire's script, I think, is supposed to convey. So even though their styles are significantly different, Kurineru's artwork is, I think, a positive change for this comic. Gives it a little bit of a fresh look, and also it fits the veneer of the flashback for it's not old West times because it's in Canada, but that sort of frontier mentality, it works very well. Moving over to pacing and structure, the pacing is a mixed bag, but not for the reason you would normally think. In and of itself, this issue is fine. It's well paced, it's engaging, the scenes transition well from one to the other, and you get a lot of new information that clarifies, what's going on, where does this monster come from, how does Fran fit into everything, and the shift away from Fran to Helen, maybe not permanently, but it makes a big change in development and with the direction that the narrative is flowing. So it's all good on all those fronts. Where it's mixed is that this series is just a very slow pace. I wouldn't even call it a slow burn. I would say like a slow simmer. The plot is starting to take shape as far as where it's headed and what's going to happen. But that's after 6 issues at this point, which is a lot to ask for any reader, especially when this issue in particular is $5.99. That's not cheap. And so to expect readers to kind of hang on with a very slow-paced comic that isn't telling you much, it's only teasing out information, that's where you get the mixed bag of pacing, which may be too much. You get the feeling that this is the kind of story that it makes sense, or it might be better to wait for the trade so that you can put it all together and then read it in one shot. Let's talk about the themes, or what is the major message that comes out of this issue. Because you get so much new information that clarifies what's going on, it turns the story, the original part of the story, from an oddball relationship between Fran and this Fishfly monster into a story about a cycle or a legacy of revenge. We now know that the first Fishfly monster that we encounter in the beginning of the series came out of an incident where a robber nearly killed a small boy, and the grief that comes out of that, and the pain and the heartache that comes out of it. Now, through Helen's flashback, we know that that's basically a repeat from what happened originally with Biddy Murphy. So even though it sort of was a strange friendship, which was where it started off, now it is a cycle or a legacy of revenge, which is a very different twist from the story that you were expecting coming into this issue. Final thoughts. What do we think about Fishflies number 6? It takes a break from the adventure with Fran and her very strange friend to explain the history of what's going on, the cycle of violence that created the curse, how it affects Bell. Apparently, it's been affecting Bell River for decades upon decades, and Helen's place in the center of that cycle. The script goes a long way from Lemire to kind of clarifying the narrative and dispelling a lot of the question marks and the ambiguity of what's going on. And the guest artist sort of gives new life and gives you a fresh view of what's happening. That said, the pacing is listless. So if you're not in it for the very, very, very slow burn, you may want to wait for the trade. That's not, I'm not trying to put the comic book down, but that's just sort of the nature of how Lemire is writing the story. It's just very slow. And to pay individual comic issue prices for what will probably be better in the trade, which will probably be cheaper in the collective, it's a lot to ask. Therefore, we're going to give Fishflies number 6 a 7.8 out of 10. Let me know down in the comments, are you following the series or not? If you find these reviews helpful to make a decision about whether or not to buy it, give me a thumbs up, let me know. Otherwise, please stay tuned through the outro for the next review.